where are all the mom games? Where are they? If you have no idea what I'm talking about, let me introduce you to the dad game genre. Games about fatherhood, where you play as a father, being a father. The modern God of War games are a great example of this. There's a lot going on in the story. It's a world of mythology and action and drama. But at its core, the story is about Kratos and Atreus, father and son, and how Kratos learns to be a father over the course of their adventure. He starts out stoic and emotionally unavailable, and in the end becomes willing and able to emotionally invest in his son. There are many other games like this, and clearly there's an appetite for these stories from the video game audience, as well as a desire to tell these stories from video game developers. I think this is because the video game industry, from creation to consumption, is dominated by men. And as men have grown up with video games, they have children and become fathers. And the subject of fatherhood becomes extremely relevant and resonant to the men of the game industry. And so it's only natural that those kinds of stories would come into popularity. This is Cory Barlog, the director of God of War.
It's a big influencing factor. And I think as I was growing up in the earlier games, the family was sort of the individual extended family. My family lived farther away from me, so I was a lot more separated from them. So the work family became the entire family. Now, I have them intermixing. Even in the earlier games, that's how I kind of rooted myself in the first story, was writing the first few drafts with my dad and kind of finding the struggle of Kratos and Zeus, the sort of father-son story. But this father-son story is told from that different angle, the son becoming the father. So
I think it's a sign of maturity for the art form. These stories are often deep and explore nuances of relationships that games scarcely explored 15 or 20 years ago. However, to my knowledge, there are almost no medium or high-profile games in which you play as a mother, being a mother. And as motherhood is at least as deep and interesting a subject as fatherhood, if not more so, then why are stories of motherhood virtually absent in video games? Is motherhood unappealing to game developers? I think a better question would be, is game development unappealing to mothers? And the answer to that question is yes. In fact, the game development industry is not only unappealing to mothers, it is actively hostile to women and mothers, and systematically filters them out of the industry through abuse, discrimination, and neglect. Don't take my word for it. There are all too many examples of this in the game industry. And it's at this point that I'd like to issue a content warning for descriptions of sexual harassment, assault, and suicide. Cecilia de Anastasio of Kotaku.com wrote a thorough report uncovering the sexual discrimination at Riot Games, one of the biggest video game companies, known best for League of Legends. Speaking with dozens of employees, the piece uncovered many ugly details from the company of how women's careers were systematically held back. The leadership team would constantly ixnay any female candidate for leadership. Hiring a woman into a leadership position proved impossible for Lacey, she said, and she left the company in part because of the sexism she'd personally experienced. She said her direct manager would ask her if it was hard working at Riot being so cute. Sometimes, she said, he'd imply that her position was a direct result of her appearance. Every few months, she said, a male boss of hers would comment in public meetings about how her kids and husband must really miss her while she was at work. The piece goes on to detail many of the ways the women of the company were routinely harassed. Among the people we spoke to, 3 women described being groomed for positions and doing jobs above their title and pay grade until men were suddenly brought in to replace them. Both male and female sources have described seeing unsolicited and unwelcome pictures of male genitalia from bosses or colleagues. One woman saw an email thread about what it would be like to quote-unquote penetrate her, in which a colleague added that she'd be a good target to sleep with and not call again. Another said a colleague once informed her, apparently as a compliment, that she was on a list getting passed around by senior leaders detailing who they'd sleep with. The discrimination and harassment was later found to be so egregious and widespread that Riot Games was sued in a class action sexual harassment case, and in 2021 reached a settlement of $100 million. That may sound like a lot, but the Department of Fair Employment and Housing found that Riot Games was liable for up to $400 million in damages. So if you ask me, they got off easy. I want to clarify here that woman does not equal mother, but hostility to women includes hostility to mothers and motherhood, and filtering women out of the game industry early means that long maturing careers in the game industry, like that of the director of God of War, don't occur, and stories from mothers about motherhood are killed before they are even written. Activision Blizzard, another giant of the video game industry, best known for games like Call of Duty and World of Warcraft, just this year will pay $35 million to settle charges of widespread worker misconduct. From a Forbes article detailing the case, here are some of the allegations of the lawsuit. Women denied promotions, raises, or even equal pay despite overperforming their male counterparts. Women of color being criticized for their body language, asking for assistance, taking breaks, and being forced to document days spent off from work when those criticisms and requests were not made of anyone else. Breastfeeding women being kicked out of the lactation rooms so that meetings could be held there instead. Documentation of a quote-unquote cube crawl, where male employees would drink copious amounts of alcohol and harass and grope women. Male employees publicly discussing sexual encounters, speaking openly about female bodies, and joking about rape. Female employees being discouraged from taking harassment issues to HR. And maybe the worst detail from the case is how a female employee died by suicide on a company trip. It was cited that the female employee had previously faced intense sexual harassment at work, including an incident where a photo of her genitals was passed around by male employees at a holiday party. Once again, I find $35 million to be a very small slap on the wrist for a company that made $7.5 billion in 2022. I also want to stress how these are just examples that actually made it to the courtroom. The vast majority of sexual harassment and discrimination doesn't get past the Human Resources Office, if it gets there at all. Some companies have made a few steps in the right direction. CD Projekt Red is a game developer that recently introduced menstrual leave. Employees with period pain can take hours or days off, fully paid. This developer is best known for making another beloved game in the dad game genre, The Witcher 3. The Witcher 3 stars Geralt, a monster slayer, and takes you on a big adventure. But for all the details and turns of the story, the real connecting tissue is Geralt's search for his daughter, Ciri. And when he finds his daughter, it then becomes his job to keep her safe, but also let her become her own person. Unlike God of War, the story in this game can take drastically different turns based on your decisions. And interestingly, the best overall outcomes happen when you choose to trust Ciri and don't hold on to her too tightly. If you make the right choices, Geralt learns to be a better father. It's a lovely story and shows that these types of stories do have value. The Last of Us is another beloved dad game, and arguably the game that kicked off the trend in 2013. Joel Miller, the main character, tragically loses his daughter at the start of the game. Many years later, he meets Ellie and is tasked with taking her across the country. Along their journey, their bond grows, and Joel opens his heart to being a father again. The Last of Us series is not just a leading example of the dad game genre, it's also, unfortunately, a leading example of the other half of the game industry's hostility to women and mothers, the gaming audience. Whether you are a woman who makes games, plays games, or writes about games, you are sure to experience harassment and threats from men of the video game audience. At this point, it's likely a background radiation of your life. When The Last of Us Part 2 came out, the two leading voice actors, Laura Bailey and Ashley Johnson, were met with a wave of death threats and rape threats from men on Twitter and elsewhere. Even the face model for one of the characters still receives threats years later. Women voice actors have talked and posted about some of the threatening messages they get, and if you're curious to see them, there will be a link in the description. For our purposes, just know that they are some of the most violent and disgusting things you could say to a person. Things that these men would not want the women in their lives to know they are saying, least of all their own mothers. Women game streamers and YouTube creators receive constant comments of the same caliber. And if you're a woman that plays multiplayer games, you almost certainly play with the voice chat feature off because you know what kind of talk you will get from your men teammates. The Last of Us is such a beloved dad game. And it's striking to me that an audience who so embraces a story of fatherhood would be so hostile to women. Striking, but not surprising. There's no end to the list of games that men have used to express their hatred of women. Games with women writers or actors, and especially main characters, are the biggest targets. But there's also seemingly no end to the avenues that toxic men will take to express their hatred. From petitions to get women fired from game studios, to boycotts of games that dare depict women characters in a three-dimensional way, to review bombing the game on review sites. At every turn, a woman's love for video games is punished, by the game studios and by the gaming audience. Knowing this, the question of why aren't there any mom games becomes a silly one. The better question is, why the hell would there be? And yet, there are still women working in the game industry, writing about games and playing games. Women never need to prove their love of video games, but I would argue that no one in the game industry has proven their love of the art form more than women. I said earlier that the growing trend of fatherhood stories is a sign that the game industry is maturing, but when I pay attention to who is missing from these stories, the fatherhood game trend instead can feel like the natural progression of the frat boy culture of the game industry. It doesn't help that in a lot of these fatherhood games, the stories themselves are hostile to mothers, maybe a reflection of the game industry they were born from. In God of War, Atreus' mom is dead. In The Witcher 3, Ciri's mom is dead. In The Last of Us, Ellie's mom is dead. This art form will never fully mature without the stories from women and mothers. It's an absence that speaks volumes, and I desperately hope that we will start listening.